So thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Sarah Ann Rennick, and I'm with the Arab Reform Initiative. And you're joining us today for our webinar titled The In-Betweenness of the Libyan Diaspora. And this is the third in our series, The New Arab Diasporas, that's exploring changes in Arab diaspora since 2011. It's a series of discussions that we're convening between both diaspora scholars, diaspora studies experts, as well as diasporic groups and activists themselves to look at the different types of changes in the Arab diaspora since 2011, both in demographic and sociological terms as a result of conflicts, as a result of economic crises, resurgent authoritarianism, but also to look at the different forms of transnational politics, both transnational mobilization as well as translocal mobilization and activism, and how this is impacting political processes both in home countries but also in host societies. And we're looking at different things that mediate this transnational and translocal mobilization, including spatial dynamics, temporal dynamics, differences in political opportunity structures, and how this is also affecting issues related to identity and feelings of belonging. So I'm very excited for today's discussion, as we're going to be touching really on all of these different issues today, looking specifically at the Libyan diaspora and different dynamics in the Libyan diaspora, both historically and today. Looking as well at issues of liminality and what I believe it was Houda had termed rooted uprootedness, and how this is affecting patterns of mobilization of the Libyan diaspora. So I'm very pleased to be joined by two distinguished scholars in this field. We have with us Alice Alunni, who is a researcher at Durham University and who recently completed her PhD on the subject of the Libyan diaspora. And we also have Houda Mzioudet, who is a non-resident fellow at the Center for Applied Human Rights at York University. So just as a matter of housekeeping, we will start with a presentation by Alice and then a presentation by Houda. And then we will open the floor for questions and answers. So for those of you who are joining us by Zoom, you can just simply type in your questions on the Q&A section at the bottom. And for those who are joining us on Facebook Live, you can ask your questions in the comments section, and those will be transferred over to us. So I'll go ahead now and turn the floor over to Alice for the first presentation.
There we go. Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you really for inviting me to be part of the series and contribute to this discussion on the Libyan diaspora with Houda, that's done very interesting work on the subject. This series did really brought together top diaspora scholars so far, so I'm really enthusiastic to share some of the findings of my thesis with you and with the audience of the Arab Reform Initiative. I'm going to share my screen. It looks like host disable attendee screen sharing. So, okay. Perfect. Thank you very much. So yes, what I present today is part of my PhD thesis that explores the relation between national belonging, everyday nationhood, and globalization in 20th and 21st century Libya, with a focus on the agency of political elites, the civil society, and the diaspora. When I started this research, there were really no studies on the Libyan diaspora, with the exception of Anna Baldinetti's The Origin of the Libyan Nation. That was a book that explored the contribution of the Libyan diaspora to nation building, and in particular during the Italian colonization and at the time of Libyan independence. No other studies had really tackled the subject with a focus on post-independence Libya. So one of the objectives of my research was to continue to write the history of the Libyan diaspora with a particular focus on the years of the Gaddafi regime. And I did so through secondary sources that address the history of Libya more in general, but also through long biographical and semi-structured interviews with 39 research participants, both from the diaspora, but also individuals who were part of the political elite and the civil society inside Libya before and after the 2011 revolution, because my objective was to grasp really a holistic understanding of the diasporic phenomenon, not only from the perspective of the diaspora, but also from the perspective of Libyans inside the country. And I've also analyzed websites and social media pages for some of these diaspora entities and civil society organizations that emerged in post-2011 Libya, and were still available, some of these websites for organizations or entities before 2011. And overall, my direct observation of civil society in Libya in 2013 and 2014 also informed the research design. So in this presentation, I'll briefly outline the history of the Libyan diaspora and then explore how political mobilization and everyday nationalism functioned in the Libyan diaspora and how they affected the individual sense of belonging to the nation, and in particular here to the Libyan nation. So just briefly, I want to say that the Arab Reform Initiative has hosted an excellent webinar with Dr. Danamos in October, and she presented some of the findings of her upcoming book on the Libyan, Syrian and Yemeni diaspora during the Arab Spring. So I really recommend going back to that webinar for anybody interested on the subject. And I hope that my presentation in that sense can add to that conversation and provide further insights. So Dr. Moss emphasized the transnational repression and surveillance exercised by the Gaddafi regime on the Libyan diaspora. Indeed, following the repression by the regime of Muammar Gaddafi against any form of opposition inside Libya, be it student organizations or political groups, thousands of people started to leave Libya in the 1970s. The crackdown on the opposition, together with the pursuit of higher education abroad, led to migratory flows from Libya. And as Gaddafi banned the student unions and replaced them with revolutionary committees inside the country, as well as abroad, students abroad set up the so-called free student unions that soon became fertile ground to recruit members to the political opposition groups in the diaspora. Estimates suggest that by the end of the 1970s, around 100,000 Libyans had left the country out of a population of 3 million at a time. So in the late 1970s, dozens of political opposition groups started to emerge. They were active outside Libya. Among them, I mentioned the National Front for the Salvation of Libya, the Libyan Islamic Group, the Libyan National Democratic Front. Some of the members of this organization have been key protagonists in the revolution in 2011 and after. These groups reflected really diverse ideological leanings, as well as the fragmentation within the opposition to the regime abroad. And the response of the regime to this activism in the 80s and in the 90s was to call for the physical liquidation of Libyan dissidents. In 1980 alone, 10 dissidents were assassinated across Europe. And these events resulted in fear, mistrust, and division within the diaspora that clearly limited free speech and civic life, constraining activism in the diaspora. That, combined with the limited means of communication at the time, meant that recruitment within these groups and communication within the group, beyond the group, within the diaspora and beyond the diaspora was extremely difficult. Yet, Libyan people knew about these groups. They knew about the existence of these groups, both inside the country and outside. And the research participants told me a very interesting story of like paper newsletters being smuggled inside Libya by members of the groups, for instance, or trying to jam radio stations from neighboring countries. So having said so, it was only, however, with the advances in information and communication technologies in the 1990s, and even more so in the 2000s, that together with the rapprochement with the international community, there were new opportunities for interaction and public political activism within the Libyan diaspora and between the diaspora and people inside Libya. And these organizations, it was in the 2000s, really, that they emerged in the public space, both physical and online, to an extent that until then had been unprecedented. And here, the research participants really refer to the internet as a game changer. something that really created the opportunity to communicate more easily within the diaspora and between the diaspora and activists inside Libya, providing new opportunities for mobilization. The opposition in the diaspora, as a result, also became much more vocal. It started to cover conferences and seminars on human rights and advocate for reform inside the country. I'll briefly here discuss three main instances of activism in the diaspora in the 2000s. One was the activity around websites, the second, Amazigh activism, and finally, the National Conference for the Libyan Opposition. In particular, my claim is that it was by taking part in these new technologies, and in particular the internet, that the Libyan opposition in the diaspora really found a new open public space of resistance online. So when it comes to the websites, several websites like Justice for Libya, Akbar Libya, Libya Al-Yom, Libya Jil, Tawal.com, Libya Watan Huna were all websites that brought together journalists and intellectuals in Libya and in the diaspora. And they published criticism of the regime, its human rights abuses, and covered the events that were held by the diaspora on these subjects. And these, however, in Libya, who dared to do so, who dared to criticize the regime online, were harassed or imprisoned, prompting Libyan users to self-censor their political discourse. Indeed, the focus around blogging, for instance, was much more on culture, poetry, and storytelling rather than politics. These sites were used by Libyans in Libya to communicate with their compatriots in exile, but also from those in the diaspora to push for change. And they also provided a platform for discussions by giving room to emails and letters from the audience, like in the case of Libya Watan Huna. This was a really important section of the website. Now, these means of communications were essential to strengthen opposition groups, lobby foreign governments, and wage campaigns against the regime. The analysis of these websites, most important in terms of content, it pointed to the use of content and images that aim to represent a Libyan national culture as pluralistic and inclusive of ethnic minorities, to disseminate a historical narrative that emphasized the national unity, created a myth around the martyrs of the anti-colonial resistance, as well as the martyrs against the martyrs of the Gaddafi regime, while providing also historical counter-narratives to those fostered by the regime. And these, combined with the demands coming from the international community, slowly fostered the regime to open up and tackle one important question, the question of Amazigh and Amazigh activism in particular. The Amazighan were actively persecuted by the Gaddafi regime, their cultural and linguistic rights denied in public life, but people continued to nurture the heritage within the private sphere. And it was at the turn of the 21st century that, again, thanks to the use of the internet, international platforms and organizations that advanced the agenda of a growing transnational Amazigh cultural movement across North Africa came together with the Amazigh diaspora in Western Europe, in North Africa, and North America, demanding the recognition of Amazigh people and Amazigh rights across North Africa. And they supported, again, cultural pluralism and political democracy. So the internet, again, played a very important part in creating this sort of like that Madi Weissman called the landscape of group identity among Amazigh activists worldwide. And it was through this transnational movement that the Amazigh question entered the political agenda in Libya, becoming a main issue that the regime had to face. The internet indeed made Amazigh culture, organizations, their language and instances visible among the Libyan diaspora at home, the Libyan diaspora as well as inside Libya, and challenged clearly the vision of Gaddafi nation of an Arab Libyan nation. Several Amazigh foundations, associations and websites were established in the 2000s. The ones that you see are some of them. However, it's also interesting to observe how that on the one hand, these organizations and websites, they portrayed this idea of an imagined Libyan Amazigh identity that in some contexts seemed to clash to a certain extent with the sense of belonging expressed by some Libyan Amazigh inside the country, posing the question whether there was in fact a clash between the way in which Libyan Amazigh identity was understood in the diaspora and the way in which it was understood inside the country, posing the question of whether Libyanness, so the sense of belonging to Libya as a nation, and Amazighness, the sense of belonging to Amazigh as a cultural and national community, were actually to be considered mutually exclusive. So again, this together with the experience of exile, allowed individuals to connect with global networks and transnational organizations that acted as a means to raise Amazigh cultural awareness. The third example is an example of political mobilization. Here, once again, we have this time the National Conference for the Libyan Opposition. Now, the National Conference for the Libyan Opposition was held in London in June 2005. It was a conference organized by an umbrella organization which brought together a number of non-Islamist opposition groups from the diaspora, among them the National Front for the Salvation of Libya, the Libyan Constitutional Union, the Libyan League for Human Rights, as well as individuals who belonged to opposition groups that no longer existed, like, for instance, the Libyan National Democratic Front. The Libyan Muslim Brotherhood did not join these gatherings back then, as it was directly engaged at the time with the regime in an attempt at mediating with it and negotiating the release of some of their members from prison. The international discourse centered on human rights and clearly reappeared within this platform, this time marked by a very strong nationalist tone. The importance of linguistic and cultural pluralism was once again pointed out and included in the official program of the conference. The London conference was a very interesting combination of old diasporic political networks, new technology, and the regime's inability to entirely control all of these. And nevertheless, trying to react to external threats. The London conference demanded a constitution, erased the Libya Kingdom flag, brought back the 1951 national anthem, and it was, most important, televised inside Libya through satellite TV, reaching segments of the Libyan population that had not been able to access this type of informational content before. So the London conference was a clear example of the ability of the opposition abroad, not only to penetrate Libya from outside via satellite television and the internet, but also bring in a new vision and new ideologies and symbols of the nation, challenging openly what had been Gaddafi's symbols of the nation until then. And that provoked clearly a strong reaction from the regime. On the one hand, it tried to create a space for civil society activism around Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, tried to create some space for even political reform discussions around political reforms, the idea of a constitution. This space was like very narrow, and by the end of the 2000s, it actually was an experience that came to an end. However, the national and transnational political and civil society networks did remain the main legacy of that decade, together with the appearance of new ideologies as well as civil society activism inside the country. And these clearly strengthened the connectedness, the links among the sections of the Libyan people inside the country and in the diaspora. And these networks, this connection, they all came out much more explicitly in 2011. And with that also that symbology, they recalled the national symbology, they recalled the era of independence rather than the symbols imposed by the regime. So this way we get to the 2011 revolution, which, as I said, it created new links that had started new spaces that in a way had already started to open up in the 2000s, both on the internet and within civil society inside Libya. And here, however, the exchanges and the ties between Libyans at home, so to speak, and Libyans in the diaspora really intensified. New markedly political spaces of interaction were created by the revolution. The involvement of the Libyan diaspora was observed within translational institutions, within leading humanitarian efforts of international organizations and NGOs. Diaspora members were seen advocating for the revolution through peaceful protests, online websites, social media, and newly established media outlets. I can think here of like websites, diaspora creations, or social media creations like Shabab Libya, Libya Feb 17, and Libya Lahad, that was like the voice of the revolution. Other members of the diaspora also joined the anti-regime forces in the battlefield. Through these new platforms of interaction, people in Libya and in the diaspora really started to converge to an extent they hadn't been able to do before, with their ideas, images, and practices of the nation. And this brings me to the last part of my presentation. The activism of the political opposition in exile before the 2011 revolution had a really important impact on the everyday life of the members and the everyday practices of these individuals and their families. It heavily determined their sense of identification and national belonging, and strengthened their attachment to Libya. That really explains their involvement in the 2011 revolution. But where did that come from? It came from a strong sense of commonality that was based on this sense of shared culture and kinship that emerged and then contributed to generate nationalness, this sense of belonging within the diaspora. In particular, it was in the familial, private space, in social gatherings, and within the Libyan schools that a sense of belonging and identification to the nation not only emerged through everyday practices that were related to marriage within the Libyan community, for instance, practices of like daily speaking a language or a dialect within the household, consuming traditions, food, clothes, but also reproducing historical narrative and commemorating certain events within Libyan history. So these overall really established a really strong sense of a really strong idea of blood relation and ancestry as the foundation of the Libyan national community that was reproduced across the space and time in the diaspora, with some differences between first and 1.5 and second generations. So those like younger people within the diaspora. And in this respect, I'll be brief, but basically the first generation clearly manifested a very strong identification with and loyalty to Libya as the one and only homeland, the one and only nation, regardless of other acquired citizenship, and even more so if obviously they were politically engaged vis-a-vis Libya, vis-a-vis the homeland. More complex, however, is the way in which second generation and 1.5, when I say 1.5, I mean young people that moved to the new country, so-called host country, that they were very young. Second generation, those that were born in the host country. So they also developed a sense of identification, but here it was much more complex in the sense that clearly the parents had a very clear, important role in transmitting a sense of a Libyan heritage, their intent to maintain the lineage, the connection to the family and to the land. They were all very essential to foster an attachment to Libya. As they express emotional attachment to Libya, they also, however, express resentment for not being considered fully members of the host countries again, and that what motivated them to ultimately express their allegiance to Libya was also this lack of understanding and acceptance from the host communities. In turn, these explain three concepts that I could clearly see within, especially the younger generations within the Libyan diaspora. The idea of multi-site embeddedness, that is the idea of belonging and engagement in multiple communities, and a sense of belonging that is to be understood situated, partial, and contingent. And finally, this sense of in-betweenness, being caught between two worlds, while sometimes feeling unwanted in both. And this in turn was reflected in their idea of the nation. And here I'll be very brief. But basically, the idea here is that interviewees in the diaspora, they really observed how that experience, they thought, strengthened actually the sense of belonging to the Libyan nation, above that of belonging to other groups like tribes, for instance, and accused their peers in a way in Libya to actually not have overcome these groups like the tribe or the city, the locality. This was obviously rebuked by a Libyan inside the country that accused youth from the diaspora of not actually understanding the fundamentals of Libyan society. As a result of these tensions and the situation evolving on the ground, 1.5 and second generation really positioned themselves vis-a-vis a multitude of others and articulated their identities in the host land and in the homeland. Contributing in the 2000 revolution was a way to do so. It was a way to reclaim their Libyanness. They chose to engage. In some circumstances, they returned to Libya, but also they left in some cases when the conflict escalated again in 2014. And it was through these experiences that actually the commonalities and differences between them and their peers in the diaspora clearly emerged. And then we can conclude that in this sense, young Libyans inside the country at the same time pointed to these differences to an extent that the youth from the diaspora did not perceive. And they felt, had a self-perception of themselves as much more in tune with Libyans at home. So all in all, the experience of transnationalism, the experience of like living in a so-called diaspora, did not eradicate their sense of belonging to Libya. But it remains extremely contingent and partial, and it results in interactions and mobilization that are really fluid and that reflect the individual sense of in-betweenness. And I'd like to conclude this with the words of very famous scholars of diaspora, the oscillation between loyalty and skeptical detachment that characterizes the performance of diasporic lives is, in my view, he says, an example of the way everyone, including nationals, will have to live in an increasingly heterogeneous and plural world. And I thought that these really, really reflected the conclusions of my research. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alice. That was a very rich presentation. I think there's going to be a lot of things that we're going to be able to go back to in the question and answer, both about the forms of political mobilization of the opposition and the constraints and opportunities for that, but also about this idea of these different feelings of belonging and the generational differences that we're seeing in that, especially relevant looking post-2011 and these changes in the diasporas. So I'll turn now to Houda for your presentation.
Thank you, Sarah, for the presentation, and thank you also for the Arab Reform Initiative for this very much needed initiative on highlighting the Arab diaspora in the MENA region, especially in zones of conflicts, be it in Libya or Syria or elsewhere. I'm going to share my my presentation. Just need to see the. I'm going to share it with you here on Zoom. Okay. Okay, so my presentation is entitled Libyan Diaspora in Transition, Liminality, Resistance, and Active Engagement. This presentation draws upon research, fieldwork research that I have been carrying on Libya since 2011, when the Libyan revolution started. And it also highlights the role that the Libyans in Tunisia, who represents the largest pool of Libyan diaspora populations outside of in the world, and it has materialized this whole research work in a book that I co-authored in 2016 with Megan Bradley and Ibrahim Raihat, titled Libyan Displacement Crisis, Uprooted by Revolutions and the Civil War. And it was published in 2016 by Georgetown University Press. And I will put the link to the book at the end of this presentation. So, so usually when we talk about Libyans and diasporic Libyans, especially when it comes to Tunisia, which is Libya's closest neighbor, given the fact that, you know, the largest population concentration of Libyans is in Western Libya, in the historical Tripolitania area. So usually people, they would wonder about the Libyans who have who are currently residing in Libya or living in Libya. And the question usually that people would ask is about the demographics of Libyans. How many Libyans are there in Tunisia? And that's a very problematic question that usually I myself, as a person who has been researching Libya since 2011, struggled to find an answer for that, because the question has become very politicized after the Libyan revolution and the impact of the conflict on Tunisia. You know, there was a spillover effect on of the Libyan conflict in Tunisia in a way that it was this question of having reliable statistics from the Tunisian Minister of Interior was becoming a contentious issue, whether from Tunisian officials, but also in Libya. So, but usually there are some official and unofficial figures from civil society organizations, be it Libyans or Tunisians, and they had put the number in 2011 to 1 million Libyans, but that number would include Libyans who would visit Tunisia, sorry, and then wouldn't reside there for, you know, indefinitely. And then the number was being manipulated, you know, time and time again, ever since, between, you know, again, different, you know, civil society organizations, but also even government officials in Tunisia, because it's a political issue, you know, because of their legal status is not clear. So, and I will be talking about that later on in my presentation. So the statistics, unfortunately, remain very, very flawed and unreliable, be it when it comes to the Tunisian government, because of the nature of the Libyan conflict, but also because of the transition in Tunisia, which is still very shaky. So dealing with this topic, which is a kind of hot potato for Tunisian officials, remains very risky. I mean, I'm putting the Tunisian map with the different border posts linking Tunisia to Libya, especially Ras el-Jdir border crossing. That's where most Libyans, you know, would transit to go to Tunisia before the revolution and after the revolution, of course. The Libyans in Tunisia usually are considered as almost, you know, a part of the Tunisian, you know, family, as so to speak, for a lot of people. This is how they see them. But and historically, you know, Libyans have come to Tunisia. You know, one probably salient date is 1911, when the Italians, you know, occupied Libya, and 1 century later, Libyans came again to Tunisia, many of them as refugees, but usually temporary ones, because they were, a lot of them, they were escaping, you know, the conflict, where, be it, you know, from Gaddafi, you know, militias at the time, but also the NATO strikes on Libya. Second wave came after the outbreak of the civil war in 2014, with Operation Dignity, that was initiated by Marshal Khalifa Haftar at the time. And in 2019, there was another wave that came after the renewed, you know, attacks, you know, from the self-styled, you know, Libyan National Army led by Khalifa Haftar. So I call this this movement of Libyans in Tunisia as exile, because the term refugee that has been used sometimes is very problematic too, and very political. And so I usually try to avoid that term, because it is very heavy loaded and needs a lot of and it doesn't really describe, you know, the status of Libyans in Tunisia. Geographically, Libyans, you know, they're scattered almost. I mean, they tend to concentrate on urban centers, mainly in Tunis, but also in other cities like Sfax and Sousse, where you have a large Libyan community there. Others who tend to be to rather feel that they wanted to be less of the radar, and to lead less, you know, they want to more or less avoid being, you know, seen or singled out, especially the ones who used to support Gaddafi. They tend to mingle in small towns and cities in Tunisia, including in small cities in Nabil, Mahdi, and Benin, where a lot of them they haven't unfortunately been back to Libya since 2011 because of some of their ties to the Gaddafi regime. I will be outlining a little bit about the Libyan exiled in Tunisia and its implications on the Tunisian political, social, and economic sectors. Usually, I mean, I'm putting pictures here of Libyans in front of the Libyan embassy. This is where the first, protest of Libyans in Tunisia.
Houda, I'm so sorry if I could just interrupt you. I think you're not on full screen, so we can't see you scrolling between the different slides of your PowerPoint.
Let me just see. Can you see my, oops. Is it? Okay, do you want me to share again, or I'm not sure if there is?
Yes, now we're seeing a new, yes.
Okay, sorry again. So, usually the Libyan exiled in Tunisia, they differ on their exile is centers around the fact of their political and ideological leanings. So you have Libyans in 2011 who fought with Gaddafi, and some of them, they were Gaddafi loyalists who fled to Libya, to Tunisia, and some others who are the anti-Gaddafi Libyans. They usually came to Tunisia after 2014. So, but it's not clear cut, because you always have Libyans who are non-ideologically linked to either Gaddafi or anti-Gaddafi or pro-Haftar and anti-Haftar, who have always, came to Tunisia as either as tourists or medical tourists in particular, but also as students from all walks of life. The ones who had political leanings with the Gaddafi regime, in particular, they chose Tunisia because it's easier to go there, and because they don't need visa to enter Tunisia, and so they can stay there as much as they want. And a lot of them, they didn't want to go back to Libya because they were fearing deportation. And one of that, the biggest fear was heightened when a former Gaddafi Prime Minister Baghdadi Mahmoudi was deported back to Libya from Tunisian authorities for his links to the Gaddafi regime. Also, their political the political side of the conflict in Libya is usually linked to the clashes that usually occur, especially at the Ras Deir border crossing with Tunisia. Whenever there are clashes on the border, a lot of Libyans, they fear that one of those militias on the other side of the border might take over, and so their livelihood sometimes in Tunisia is they feel is at risk. In particular, those who were supporting Gaddafi regime at the time. Economically, the Libyans have been also a contentious issue for Tunisian authorities, but also Tunisian population. They have drawn a lot of hostility from Tunisians because of their overbearing presence in Tunisia, and the fact that they were accused at one time of being a strain on the Tunisian state, especially its resources, and taking advantage of the subsidies of Tunisian, especially for fuel or bread or any of those livelihoods that Libyans would basically feel that they are sharing with Tunisians, but at the same time they were not considered as being economically active. They were for some Tunisians, they were considered as being parasites, because a lot of them, they come with their money, but they don't participate in the economic life in Tunisia. But that's another complex issue as well. But with time, when a lot of Libyans they saw that because the conflict has been lingering, so the opportunity of going back to Libya was becoming very, very minuscule. A lot of them, they settled and they started, their own businesses. And so the fact that a lot of Libyans, they were contributing, for example, as to medical tourists, for instance, that was a source of income for Tunisian state. They were also considered as economic, they work also contributing through, their the setting up of, for example, of Libyan schools, Libyan restaurants, in particular in some of the Tunis suburbs where you have a large concentration of Libyans, in particular in Nasr and in Lawina, where you have almost like little Tripolis, so to speak. Socially speaking, Libyans in Tunisia, they are not monolithic. So they come from all different social backgrounds and classes. So you don't have like rich Libyans, living, for example, in particular. I mean, you have of course there's Libyans living in particular neighborhoods of Tunis, but usually you also have some less affluent ones living in, for example, some more or less affluent areas, because again of I'm trying to not essentialize the presence of Libyans in Tunisia as being just one particular group. You can have people who belong, for example, to affluent families, or some of them they were unable, for example, to secure, for example, visa to go to some European countries, so they had to settle in Tunisia for some time. Others, who have seen that their presence in Tunisia was becoming was getting, getting longer there, so they had to set up their own schools. For example, the Libyan schools, there were Libyan schools in Sfax, for instance, or in Tunis, where some of their children who were even born in Tunisia, they had to continue their education in Libyan schools, following the Libyan curriculum that is usually being monitored by the Libyan Ministry of Education through the Libyan embassy in Tunis, and the consulates in Sfax as well. Another type of Libyan exiled or diaspora Libyans are the ones who have sought refuge or exile in the West, in particular in Western Europe. And I'm taking, I wouldn't go into details about, every Western European country, but my experience, at least, with my first experience with Libyans was in 2005. I lived in Scotland back then. And in the city of Glasgow, you have a big Libyan community there, but also in cities like Manchester and London. And the UK represents, as Alici has said earlier, also a good pool of Libyans who have fled, Gaddafi regime since the 70s. But one particular initiative or active or mobilization of Libyans in Western Europe, in particular the UK, is that of Libyans or Libyans, some of them, dual Libyans, Libyan Britons in particular. They had initiated, some transnational activities, transnational associations or organizations that would be speaking to the Libyans in Western Europe, but also Libyans inside of Libya. And so a lot of them, they have played a big role in highlighting, the Libyans in diaspora in Europe, whether, for example, in Sweden or Italy or Germany, whether in art, music, media, literature, civil society, etc. And one initiative that I find particularly interesting is that of the Mirror podcast, which is an initiative by a Libyan Briton, Tariq Al-Miri, who tried to highlight, big Libyan figures who played a role in highlighting in Libyan society and culture. And one of them I chose Hisham Mattar, because he's an award-winning author who wrote a very interesting book called the Return, about exile the exile of his family to Egypt and then to the US, and how the Gaddafi regime has sought, you know, to repress them. And it's very, I mean, the story of Libyan exile in the West in particular is quite intense when it comes especially to the fact that some of them, they have been assassinated or, you know, being disappeared by the Gaddafi regime. So so in that podcast, you know, you hear tales of resilience, of hope, of survival of Libyans, and that's something that I find interesting in the characteristics of Libyans in the West. Libyans also, they were mobilizing for you know, when it comes to human rights and transitional justice, and in that the lawyers for justice in Libya, they played a big role since 2018, I believe, or 19, in trying to highlight, you know, those spoilers of the conflict in Libya, and trying to bring them to sort some kind of accountability for the crimes that have been committed, in particular, you know, the Libyan National Army, but also the other militias that are linked to the General National, the GNA. So their work has been quite instrumental, because they would bring lawyers who would try to do some kind of lobbying regarding, you know, regarding I mean, the conflict, but also investigating crimes, you know, that have been committed by different, you know, actors in the conflict in Libya. The Libyan diaspora, their legal status is, again, as I said earlier, is very ambiguous and vague, especially when it comes to a country like Tunisia, where you have the largest Libyan presence as a diasporic presence. For instance, in Tunisia, they feel, a lot of them, they feel that they are at home, but still they are not considered as totally, you know, part of the Tunisian, you know, fabric of society, because they are seen as strangers because of their cultural differences, not only in Tunisia, but also in other countries like Algeria, Egypt, and where you have a strong Libyan presence there. There are very few who have obtained the status of refugees from the UNHCR, but generally speaking, a lot of them, they live in the status of limbo, because again of how the Tunisian system, especially the Minister of Interior, is trying to keep the status quo of not granting either permanent residence to Libyans or any other sort of document that ascertain their legal status in Tunisia. So others, you know, they are still temporary residents. Some of them, they are tourists. Other are transient travelers. So they are always Libyans in Tunisia or elsewhere. They are trying to navigate, you know, this very ambiguous system when it comes to their residence in those countries in which they are exiled there. I also looked at transnational political activism of Libyans in the other side of the Atlantic, especially North America, Canada and the US. Historically, you have smaller Libyan population that have lived in the US since the 1970s and 80s. Of course, they are less prominent when it comes to their number than Libyans, for example, in the UK, but they had more impact when it comes to their presence and their voice that has become very vocal, especially in 2011 when the Libyan revolution started. A lot of them, they organized protests, you know, in Washington DC, but also in other cities where you have a strong Libyan presence, whether in Florida or in Texas, etc. And one particular organization that has been set up in 2019 is the Libyan American Alliance, whose motto, whose work, you know, is on supporting law, democracy, and civic state in Libya. And their work usually centers around, you know, bringing some kind of relief to Libyans, especially since 2011, whether internally displaced Libyans, but also those who are more or less victim of the conflict. When COVID-19 started, some of them, they started initiative, you know, to send, you know, Libyan doctors, for instance, to to Libya in order to monitor the COVID-19 situation there, through their experience, by working as doctors, for example, in American hospitals, in the DC area in particular. And so their work has been more political than social as well when it comes to the lobbying to end Libyan conflict, for instance. And their lobbying, centers on reaching out to US government officials, Congress, also the UN. And they were trying to be like the focal point between them and the Libyan political actors, the GNA in particular, whom they have a strong link with them. I try to usually, when we talk about Libyan diaspora, the question that comes across is usually what future lies for Libyan diaspora, which is very, very uncertain, unfortunately, because of the conflict. As long as the conflict lingers, the Libyan diaspora will be facing, the biggest issue of returning home. This longing for return is still very, very, very alive, but it's very hard for a lot of Libyans to see in the diaspora to see a permanent return to Libya. But they keep this semblance of hope and resilience, which I find quite interesting in the narratives of Libyan that I have met, when they still keep, this hope that one day the return to Libya will be something, will be something that will materialize, that it will not just, be a false hope, as it were. A lot of Libyans, I came across, Libyan culture through, their presence in the diaspora, whether in Tunisia or elsewhere, but in particular, when it comes, to non-Arab Libyans, be it Amazigh or Tubu or Tuaregs, and they were able to highlight, the other face of Libya that we usually don't see, through their culture, their music. And this is one picture that I have captured in 2016 of an event that was organized by the French embassy in Tripoli, which was based at the time in Tunis, that brought, Libyan artists and but also academics who were in some ways trying to highlight, the different facets of Libya. And finally, I wanted just to to give you, as I said earlier, to give to highlight, the work that I have that I've done with two other academics on Libya, the Libyan Displacement Crisis book, that delves into the internal displacement of Libyans, but also the Libyan diaspora, in particular Tunisia. We didn't get the chance, unfortunately, to focus on Egypt because, again, that's another big big issue that that Libyan diaspora in Egypt has been struggling when it comes to their presence there, and it's a very political and a political issue that I think unfortunately right now, with the conflict lingering, it is going to be very hard to deal with, at least in the short term. And thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Houda, for, again, a very, very rich and thorough presentation exploring so many different facets of both the Libyan exile community in Tunisia, but also different types of mobilization and initiatives that are happening in North America and in the UK. So we'll turn it over now to some questions. We have some questions coming in. I'm conscious of time, so I'll try to get through as many as I can. There's a first question here, and it's really addressed to both of you, and it's about your reflections on how the conflict since 2014 has affected diaspora networks, and how this polarization is manifesting itself in the diaspora and in transnational mobilization. And if I could just follow that question for Alicia in particular, you had mentioned in your presentation the London conference and how this was a way of having a kind of a common banner of nationalism for opposition groups, and it created this new space for mobilization. I'm wondering if you feel like something like that is even possible today, given the political fracturing that we're seeing in Libya and how this is affecting the polarization in the diaspora. So this is really a question for both of you. I don't know if, yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first if that's okay. Yes, thank you very much for the questions. They're all very interesting, as I'm very lucky to see all of them. So I'm going to try to be quick. Absolutely. Yes, you mentioned the London conference. Can we have something similar to that today? How is the civil conflict impacting the diaspora networks? I think on the one hand, it was very important to see how in the aftermath of the revolution, there has been a period in which civil society organizations were actively working on this aspect. So with the idea of like bringing Libya together, the idea of like overcoming regionalism, overcoming like, you know, this focus on cities or like, you know, even to a certain extent ideologies. I think today, at least from my, you know, kind of social media monitoring, I don't see as much these type of initiatives and activities as there were back then. And so I think in this respect, we see civil society moving in different spaces. They're trying to be much more involved than they were back then within the official processes, the kind of like peace building initiatives led by the UN, or even trying to run some sort of like, you know, local initiatives around, you know, kind of monitoring conflict or trying conflict. But I think in general, certainly the civil conflict did have also a polarizing effect in some way in the diaspora. When it comes to the two hubs, Cairo and Istanbul, I think yet again that these kind of reflects a more general polarization, also like regional, and it's not just to be seen inside Libya. I think here there's a big role to play from the side of civil society, trying inside Libya and in the diaspora to work together and kind of like create these spaces.
Houda, did you want to?
Sure. There's a question that Ibrahim Natil has asked, you know, what is the role of the civil society organizations in the current circumstances? Well, they do play a very, very actually vital role there because I'm talking about the Libyan diaspora, in particular in Western Europe and North America, more than the ones in Tunisia, because of they have a strong leverage, political leverage, at least, you know, with the governments of the countries in which they live in, whether in the US, with the US administration, the US Congress, also the UN, and in the UK, as I mentioned earlier on, with Lawyers for Justice in Libya, but also other Libyans who have settled, have been living there as academics, but also as doctors. You know, they are able, you know, to bring in some kind, for example, relief to Libyans who are trapped in Libya when it comes, you know, to internally displaced Libyans, organizing, for instance, you know, some also conferences, for example, sorry, not organizing, but organizing, for example, initiatives when it comes to you know, to highlighting the problems, you know, regarding internal displacement, but also women issues, women human rights, you know, issues, other cultural events, for instance, that have been organized, you know, whether in Tunisia or elsewhere. So, I mean, the role is, as I said, since the conflict 2011 has been much more, very, very, very important when it comes, you know, to bring in at least the voices of Libyans that are usually never heard, unfortunately, be it in media, especially, but also, you know, with policymakers, you know, in the countries in which they live in.
Okay, thank you so much. We also had another question about, and this refers to, I think, what you were talking about, Alicia, about the how the internet and these new technologies actually opened a space. And it was a question, I think this actually coincides with the last webinar with Dana Moss about transnational oppression. Have there been any efforts to censor the internet and to use internet and new technologies of surveillance to hinder diaspora mobilization since 2011?
Okay, just briefly. So before 2011, as I said, we had these kind of like more than sure it was censorship, but it was a form of surveillance of what kind of activities and like, you know, kind of speech was going on and discourse was going on online. And there were clear cases of like then activists or families of activists inside Libya then being arrested or like, you know, put in very difficult situations from the regime itself. In post-2011, it's very interesting space because actually first there has been first one thing I think most people would agree with me is that the internet is free to an extent that it has never been before inside the country. So there is a huge access to content that people were not able to access before. However, I think especially given like the current circumstances, there's seemed to be a huge form of self-censorship. Again, like, you know, people would rather not address, you know, kind of political discourses online. Research showed in the past that Facebook is, for instance, the main social media inside the country is mostly used for private rather than political kind of purposes. And so I think while officially the internet will be monitored but not censored, if you see what I mean, there will still be a form of self-censorship from the part of people that use it, for sure.
I'm trying to answer some few questions that I've got here about, you know, something that I mentioned earlier about the Libyan diaspora being much more active, politically speaking, in Western Europe and North America than the ones in Tunisia. As I earlier talked about, you know, how Libyans in Tunisia, a lot of them, they live under the radar, so they try to become invisible in Tunisian society because of their complex situation. They're neither residents nor exiles, so a lot of them, they try to at least, you know, live, you know, to kind of survive on a daily basis. And a lot of them, they don't have the time, if I can put it this way, you know, to kind of focus too much on trying, for example, to alleviate, for example, I mean, to have, let's say, a role, for example, in the rebuilding of the country, or highlighting, you know, the suffering of Libyans, you know, especially the ones who are trapped in the conflict inside of the country. If there were a few initiatives of there are some Libyan political activists, I wouldn't call them political, but, you know, activists who are who live in Libya because of their inability, for example, you know, to be able to travel outside of Libya, to go to Western countries, and some of the ones that I've met, you know, they have been displaced many times, you know, whether they were displaced initially in Libya, and then they had to come to Tunisia, and they were unable, for example, to go to other countries. So some of them, they have become vocal supporters, vocal, you know, critics, for example, of whether of the GNA or of the LNA, because of their role, direct or indirectly, in their own displacement. For instance, there are some journalists, for instance, you know, who in Libya, Libyan journalists in Tunisia, who had escaped, you know, because of their serious threats to them, and so they were able, you know, to not organize in some kind of, you know, grassroots organizations to highlight, for example, the plight of, you know, for example, freedom of press in Libya, because again of the sensitivity of living in Tunisia. Because at one time, Tunisian government has put restrictions on Libyans who were in Tunisia not to do politics in Tunisia, because Tunisian democracy is still very fragile, and so a lot of them, they try not to make themselves visible, be it as civil society organizations or even as political activists, and that explains why their political and social, civil society leverage is not as strong and doesn't have a lot of impact as their peers, as other Libyan diasporic populations in Western Europe and North America.
Okay, thanks. We have another question coming in about the pro-Gaddafi diaspora groups and how their status and their position has changed in social, political, and economic terms from before 2011 and after 2011. Obviously, they were not, you know, targets of repression pre-2011. Where are these groups today, and how are they developing? Are they actively engaged still, and in what sense are they engaged? Is there hope for a return at some point?
I may answer this question. Yes. Well, for the again for the pro-Gaddafi diaspora populations, they're the ones at least, you know, that I have come in contact with in Tunisia, they always try to keep a low profile because of their sensitivity of the situation there, at least between 2011 2014. After that, because they were followed by other Libyans who were not necessarily pro-Gaddafi, but because of how the conflict has gotten out of control, so some of them, they have become extremely anti-Libyan revolution, quote unquote, and so they found maybe they have some common grievances on how the Libyan conflict has generated all these, you know, Libyan militias who in the name of the Libyan revolution, they were exercising human rights abuses against them. But a lot of them, unfortunately, they remain in Tunisia out of the radar. Some of them, they're not even, you know, they probably don't have any official legal status in Tunisia because of the fear, again, of being returned back to Libya. And this is something that Libyan diasporic Libyans have always, you know, struggled with when they were living, whether in Europe or in the US, how the regime would hound them, would chase them. So they would prefer to have to keep a low profile and not and to mingle themselves in the population. So it's so they're I don't see that they have played a big role in when it comes, you know, to either peace building or reconciliation, even though you will have sometimes, you know, at least I know one Libyan who is internally displaced Libyan who had fled, you know, his has fled Libya, you know, at least, you know, 3 or 4 times, and he now lives in Tunisia, and he's very active when it comes, you know, to bring in the two parties in the conflict, be it the GNA or the LNA, to some kind of accountability because of the human rights abuses that they have committed against, you know, his own population. I mean, his own people, but also against other Libyans. So it's a very complex issue there. This specific part when it comes, you know, to those pro-Gaddafi Libyans, at least in Tunisia, how they are trying to keep, you know, some kind of normality in Tunisia, or probably, I don't know more about Egypt, but I guess they have probably much more maybe role when it comes, you know, to the conflict, more active, proactive, I guess.
If we have the time, I take the question on the Amazigh element, if we have the time.
Yes, go ahead.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Great question again. Yes, I spoke about the Amazigh, and the question is, was it pluralism within or difference from a Libyan national community? I would say absolutely it was pluralism within. It was the willingness, the express request to be part of the Libyan national community and to have their cultural and political rights recognized within that community. So the two are not exclusive. And the question says, the Amazigh flag being flown in the Nafusa mountains or by Nafusa militias in 2011. Yes, but that was flown also next to the Libyan flag. And if you look at the cultural events that were held at that time following the revolution, in the aftermath of the revolution, also for Amazigh New Year, the Amazigh flag always fly next to the Libyan flag. And I think that was something very interesting, and they came across very clearly, both from individuals that identified as Amazigh inside the country, but also within the diaspora. So it's actually much easier for them to reconcile these two forms of belonging that we might expect. But there's a big but. There is the willingness from the other side to recognize, cultural and political rights of the other side. And this is where I think, again, also to answer other questions, this will be a very interesting space, I think, where civil society and the civil society in the diaspora might work together.
Okay, I think we'll just have one more question now. And this is, maybe a big question, but a good one to end on in that way. It's regarding the future role of the Libyan diaspora in Libyan politics within Libya. And obviously that depends a lot on where the conflict goes and how the conflict ends, I think. But just from your own research, the groups you've been in contact with, that you have researched, what role do you think they would like to play, and what role do you think they can meaningfully play in Libyan politics in the future?
Okay, I'll take this question. At least, I'm going to talk a little bit about, I'll give probably half an answer to this question, because at least from what I know from the Libyan, for example, American Alliance, who have a strong relationship with the GNA, these might play a big role when it comes, to the Libyan either reconciliation or bringing, what they describe as spoilers of the conflict, because again of their political leverage in Washington DC in particular. So they might probably be counterbalanced, to the anti Haftar or anti LNA coalition there. But it's much more complex than that, because I see that these same Libyan diasporic populations might have different political and ideological lines in which they are not necessarily in tune with the rest of Libyans, because these are people who have left Libya, for instance, maybe 40 years ago. And so it will be hard sometimes, to be able to find some kind of common ground between them and other Libyan political actors in the country. At least this is how I see it. Probably there's a question that I have seen from Mary Fitzgerald about Libyans in Istanbul and Cairo, even though I'm not very familiar with Libyans in Istanbul, but from what I heard from at least from one Libyans who was in Istanbul, that at one time you have more pro-Muslim Brotherhood Libyans who would go to Istanbul because of the strong links between Erdogan and the GNA in particular, and Turkey's active involvement in the conflict in Libya today. But there was this kind of tendency that started in the last few years, where you have more pro-Haftar, pro-LNA Libyans who would go to Istanbul, and some of them they bought some real estate there. So, but that again, it needs to be it's still a question mark. We don't know what was going on there, but I guess a lot of business going on there. This is something that happens in all conflicts. That unfortunately some warlords would make a lot of money out of money laundering, especially in Tunisia in particular, but also in cities like Istanbul. So that's so. Yeah.
Okay, Alicia, did you want to address that last question?
It would require another PhD probably in itself. That I'd be very happy to, not a PhD, a research for sure, to conduct in the future. But in general, my answer to that would be what we have seen historically and back then in 2011 is that when the opportunity arises, we see these flows, we see the coming and going, we see the returns, we see new departure. So I think this is like, again, it's very fluid. It is in the nature of the diaspora, because as we said, one of the main points of my thesis is they do maintain this very strong sense of attachment, and when possible, when the opportunity arises, they do try to engage, they do try to go back, they do try to establish relations. So I would expect this absolutely to become a feature of Libyan politics, but probably a feature of politics a bit around the world.
Okay, thank you so much. That's a great way to end it, because that kind of opens up for our future discussions in this webinar on the new Arab diaspora. So I want to thank you both, Alice and Houda, for being with us today and for sharing so much of your time and your energy and your vast research and knowledge of the subject with us. And I'll just briefly announce the next webinar in this series, which will be on November 17th. It will be looking at the Syrian diaspora, and specifically the Syrian diaspora in Europe, and different dynamics that mediate transnational mobilization. And that will be with Nora Ragab and Eleni Diker. So there will be information available about that, that webinar coming up, available on the website and the social media channels of the Arab Reform Initiative. So thank you so much again, both of you, and have a good day.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, bye.